The 2026 Formula One season has just started, and Mercedes already looks unstoppable. In the very first race of the year at the Australian Grand Prix, George Russell crossed the finish line in first place. Right behind him, Kimi Antonelli secured second. A dominant Mercedes 1-2 finish in the opening race of a brand new era. But what happened just hours after that victory is now sending shockwaves through the paddock. Because Ferrari engineers began analyzing the data from Melbourne, and what they claimed to have discovered could change the entire championship. According to multiple reports inside the paddock, Ferrari believes the Mercedes engine may be exploiting a hidden advantage in the new 2026 Power Unit regulations. An advantage that could be worth up to 30 horsepower during key acceleration moments. In modern Formula One, that is the difference between fighting for points and dominating the grid. Now, the governing body is taking a closer look, which means the team that just celebrated the perfect start to the season could suddenly be facing the first major technical investigation of the new era. And if Ferrari's suspicions turn out to be correct, the incredible Mercedes victory in Australia might not just be remembered as the first win of the season. It could become the moment when the biggest technical controversy of 2026 began. So what exactly did Ferrari find in the race data from Melbourne? Why are rival teams suddenly questioning the performance of the Mercedes Power Unit? And could this investigation completely change the fight for the championship? Because once you understand the detail that triggered this situation, the Australian Grand Prix starts to look very different. If you enjoy deep Formula One stories like this, subscribe to the channel now, because this story is only getting started. The first race of the 2026 season was supposed to answer one simple question: which team understood the new regulations better than everyone else? But by the end of the Australian Grand Prix, that question had already turned into something much bigger, because the performance Mercedes showed in Melbourne did not just look competitive, it looked dominant. From the moment the cars hit the track during practice, the W17 immediately caught the attention of every engineer in the paddock. The car looked stable through corners, it looked incredibly efficient on the straights, and more importantly, it looked extremely strong when accelerating out of slow turns. George Russell quickly set the tone during the weekend. In the final practice session, he delivered a lap more than half a second faster than the closest Ferrari. Half a second may not sound dramatic outside Formula One, but inside the paddock, that gap immediately raises eyebrows, especially at the start of a brand new regulation era. Normally, when the sport introduces completely new engine rules, the field stays tight in the early races. Every team is still learning. Every engineer is still trying to understand how the new hybrid systems behave under real race conditions. But Mercedes arrived in Australia looking unusually prepared. And when qualifying began on Saturday, the situation became even more interesting. George Russell delivered a stunning lap to take pole position. A 1-minute 18.5 second lap that immediately confirmed what many engineers were already starting to suspect. Mercedes had found something. Not just a fast car, a complete package. Power, balance, efficiency. Even more impressive was the performance of Kimi Antonelli. The young Italian secured second place on the grid, completing a full Mercedes front row for the opening race of the season. Inside the paddock, that result triggered the first quiet conversations. Because when one team locks out the front row in the first qualifying session of a new regulation cycle, it usually means one thing. They may have understood the rules better than everyone else. But the real story only started to unfold on Sunday, when the lights went out for the Australian Grand Prix. Ironically, the race did not begin perfectly for Mercedes. Both Russell and Antonelli struggled at the start. Charles Leclerc managed to jump ahead into the first corner, briefly taking control of the race for Ferrari. For several laps, the battle between Ferrari and Mercedes became one of the most fascinating moments of the weekend. The new 2026 hybrid systems created a completely different dynamic in overtaking. Drivers now had to carefully manage how they deployed electrical energy during fights. Every time Russell activated the new overtake mode, the Mercedes surged forward with incredible acceleration. But that extra power also drained the battery quickly, leaving him vulnerable to counterattacks from Leclerc once the energy level dropped. It was a strategic chess match at more than 300 kilometers per hour. And for a few moments, it looked like Ferrari might actually have the pace to challenge for victory. But then the race took a decisive turn. A virtual safety car was triggered after a mechanical failure from another car, and Mercedes reacted instantly. Both cars dived into the pits at the same time. It was a perfectly executed double pit stop. Fresh tires, minimal time lost, And suddenly, the entire race changed. Ferrari decided to stay out on track, hoping another neutralization would appear later. But that moment never arrived when they needed it. And when Ferrari finally made their stop, Mercedes had already taken control of the race. From that point forward, George Russell did exactly what championship contenders do. He controlled everything. The pace, the tires, the gap behind him. Lap after lap, the Mercedes remained calm and consistent at the front of the field. By the time the checkered flag appeared, Russell crossed the finish line with just under 3 seconds of advantage over Antonelli, securing a dominant 1-2 finish for Mercedes in the opening race of the season. On paper, it was the perfect start to the 2026 championship. Pole position, victory, maximum points, and a young teammate proving he can already fight at the front. But inside the Ferrari garage, the mood after the race was very different. Because while Mercedes was celebrating, Ferrari engineers were already studying something extremely specific in the data. Not the strategy, not the tire management, the engine performance. More precisely, how the Mercedes Power Unit was deploying electrical energy during acceleration. And what they began to notice in that data is exactly what triggered the next phase of this story. Because the numbers coming from Melbourne suggested something that Ferrari had actually feared for months. The Mercedes engine might be significantly more efficient than anyone expected. And if that suspicion is correct, the dominant 1-2 finish we just saw in Australia may only be the beginning of a much bigger story. But the story does not end with the Mercedes victory. In fact, that victory is exactly what triggered the tension now spreading through the paddock. Because once the race in Australia finished, the real work began inside the Ferrari garage. Engineers started analyzing every piece of data they had collected during the weekend. Top speeds, acceleration traces, energy deployment patterns, battery recovery cycles, every small detail that could explain why the Mercedes looked so strong in Melbourne. And slowly, a pattern began to appear. Not a dramatic one, not something that immediately screams illegal, but enough to make experienced engineers stop and look again. Because the Mercedes Power Unit seemed unusually efficient when deploying electrical energy, especially in the short bursts of acceleration that define modern Formula One. Under the 2026 regulations, this part of the power unit is critical. The balance between electric power and combustion has changed dramatically. Electrical deployment now plays a much bigger role when exiting corners and attacking on the straights. If a team manages to release that energy more efficiently than its rivals, the advantage can be enormous. And that is exactly what Ferrari engineers started to suspect. The Mercedes engine might be delivering electrical power in a way that other manufacturers have not yet achieved. Some analysts inside the paddock believe that advantage could translate into something close to 30 horsepower during certain phases of the lap. In Formula One terms, that number is massive. It is the difference between defending a position or pulling away down the straight. But here is where the situation becomes even more interesting. Because Ferrari had already been worried about this possibility before the season even began. During the winter, several engineers inside the sport quietly suggested that Mercedes might have discovered a clever interpretation of the new engine regulations. Not necessarily something illegal, but possibly a loophole. A technical interpretation hidden deep inside the rulebook. And when Ferrari compared their simulations to the real data from Australia, those concerns suddenly felt much more real. That is why the team reportedly began raising questions with the governing body. Not a formal accusation, at least not yet, but a request for clarification about how certain aspects of the power unit regulations should be interpreted. In Formula One, that type of request usually has a clear meaning. Teams want the regulators to look closer, which is why the governing body is now expected to review certain elements of the Mercedes power unit system, particularly the way electrical energy is deployed during acceleration phases. Inside Mercedes, the response has been calm. The team insists that everything about the W17 is completely within the regulations. From their perspective, the performance advantage simply comes from years of preparation, better software, better energy management, and a more efficient integration between the engine and the aerodynamic concept of the car. And to be fair, the car itself does look incredibly well designed. The W17 features sculpted side pods, a tightly packaged engine cover, and a floor designed to manage airflow extremely efficiently. All of that helps maximize traction and acceleration out of corners, which means the advantage may not come from a single trick. It may come from a perfectly optimized package. But in Formula One, perception can be just as powerful as reality. And right now, the perception inside the paddock is clear. Mercedes might have discovered something special, something that the rest of the grid has not yet fully understood. Even Ferrari drivers admitted after qualifying that the gap to Mercedes was surprisingly large. Charles Leclerc openly said that Ferrari was nowhere near the pace of the Mercedes during the session. Statements like that immediately fuel speculation, because when a top team publicly acknowledges such a gap, the rest of the paddock starts asking questions. Red Bull has already been watching the situation closely. Max Verstappen admitted after the race that his team simply does not have the fastest car right now. And when the reigning champions begin to speak like that after the first race of a season, it tells you something important about the competitive order. Right now, Mercedes appears to be the reference point of the new era. But that is exactly why the tension is growing. Because if the investigation confirms that Mercedes has discovered a legal advantage, every team will start working immediately to replicate it. Ferrari will push harder. Red Bull will accelerate development. An entire championship battle could evolve rapidly over the next few races. But if the investigation reveals that Mercedes has crossed a regulatory line, then the consequences could be far more dramatic. Technical directives, force modifications, possibly even penalties. And that is why the situation inside the Mercedes garage is becoming increasingly delicate. Because right now, they are celebrating the perfect start to the season. A dominant victory, a 1-2 finish, and a car that looks capable of fighting for the championship. But at the same time, a question is now hanging over that success. A question that teams across the paddock are asking quietly. Did Mercedes simply build the best car for 2026? Or did they discover something hidden in the new regulations that nobody else saw coming? And if the answer to that question changes, the entire story of this season could change with it.